Hi everybody and welcome to my channel. In this episode I'm going to be talking about the IPP prison sentence. And the IPP sentence is getting a lot more headlines lately. And if you've been following my channel for a while, you'll know the reason why I'm mentioning these or the IPPs quite a lot recently is because I'm actually an IPP myself. I was actually going to say an IPP prisoner. I'm an IPP prisoner serving me time in the community. Because even when you're out of prison, you're still on license for the rest of your life and you're on very strict license conditions where you can't even leave the country. You can't go on holiday with your family. And that stays with you for life or until the parole board see that it's fit, that you don't need to be on this sentence any longer. But it's getting a lot more media attention, the IPP, because it's up in the House of Commons a lot. They're debating on it. Alex Chalk, the Secretary of State, he is bringing it up a lot more. James Darley, an MP, he's all for the IPP prisoners, trying to get the sentence overturned for everybody. Because the IPP sentence was actually abolished in 2012 because it was deemed inhumane and a barbaric sentence. And they've actually called it a stain on the criminal justice system, on the prison system. But again, even though it got abolished in 2012, meaning that they no longer handed IPPs out, the people that already had it, which is 8,500 people with IPP, the 8,500 ones that were unlucky enough to get the IPP, it wasn't retrospective across the board. So all of us who are IPP before 2012 stay with the sentence stays with you. Now, it's been on Sky News today about the IPP sentence, and I'll go a little bit more into it soon. But what I do want to do before I get started on this is give a massive shout out to my solicitor and my solicitor's firm. And if there is any of you lot watching this who are IPP and you need help with anything in the legal terms, as in getting your license termination, or if you just need some legal advice, my solicitor is called Amy Hosick, and she works for Carrington's Solicitors, which is down in Nottingham. But what I'll do is, in the description of this video, I'll put the details in, and if you are needing a solicitor and a firm that are expertise in IPP, go down, click on the link, and get in touch with them, and use my name as a referral if need be. And you will be in capable hands. But the one that I'm going to talk about first off is what it says on the headlines today. What is an IPP prisoner? Imprisonment for public protection sentence explained. Now, the ones that have been following me videos, you'll see that I've already explained what the IPP actually is. But now that it's in the press, I'm just going to read out what they've actually said here, and just to see if they've actually got it right. But many IPP prisoners are kept behind bars with no release date in sight. But what exactly is the imprisonment for public protection sentence? Imprisonment for public protection, known as the IPP sentencing, is a special kind of prison sentence that courts in England and Wales used to keep serious offenders in custody for as long as they presented a risk to society. However, it was scrapped after just 7 years, with many fearing the law was being applied too broadly. Despite IPP sentencing being abolished in 2012, the change failed retrospectively assess the status of those imprisoned under the law. This means there are potentially thousands of prisoners still incarcerated for minor crimes such as stealing a mobile phone. But what exactly is an IPP sentence? According to a House of Commons briefing, unlike fixed-term sentences, IPP sentences are indeterminate and considered as open-ended. Court impose a minimum term, sometimes called a tariff, that must be served in custody before a prisoner can be considered for parole. The parole board decides when a prisoner is no longer considered a risk, meaning offenders can remain incarcerated indefinitely if they aren't granted parole. Now, I've mentioned this previously and I'll mention it again, and there's a lad just getting out last week Danny Weatherson, and he's from Newcastle. He spent 18 years in prison. He got sentenced to IPP when he was 17-year-old for stealing a mobile phone or attempted theft of a mobile phone on the court, I think it was. And he received a tariff of around 15 months. And 18 years later, he's just been released now. Now, Danny has lost the majority of his adult life by this incarceration of IPP. He could have been out when he was 18-year-old, but 18 years later, he's only just been released. So, like he mentioned when he done a report when he got out of prison last week, he was on the local news and he was saying how it's affected him, how he's lost all that time, how he should have been married with kids and he should have had a job by now, but because of this sentence, it's actually messed up his life. Now, what I'm going to do, or what I am trying to do, I've been in touch with Danny and I'm trying to get him to come on and do a podcast, so hopefully we'll get that going soon and everyone can actually see the detrimental effect of 18 years incarceration has had on Danny when he could have served only 15 months. But the parole board decides when a prisoner is no longer considered a risk, meaning offenders can remain incarcerated indefinitely until they are granted parole. If a prisoner is granted parole, their release will be subject to conditions, and if they breach the conditions within the first 10 years of being released, the person may be recalled to prison. Well, it doesn't matter about the first 10 years, it's any time, because I've been out 13 years since my first release, and it stays with you until the parole board squash it completely. The latest data taken by the Ministry of Justice at the end of 2022 revealed there are 2,892 IPP prisoners in total, with all but 35 unreleased IPP prisoners having served their minimum term and eligible for parole. According to written evidence by the Prison Reform Trust at a select committee, many prisoners eligible for parole are kept in limbo due to high numbers of deferrals and adjournments from the parole board. A parole board initiative established in 2017 found the underlying causes for delay pertained to missing reports or the need for additional reports. Now, this happened to me when I went off for my parole hearing in 2009 or 2010, and it got deferred for 6 months because they wanted more reports. So it was the day before my actual hearing. For weeks, you're getting penned up waiting for your hearing. The day before my hearing, when the anxiety is running right through your body, your mind is in overdrive, not knowing what is going to happen, your life is in the parole board's hands, and they come and say, the reports aren't all done properly, we're going to have to adjourn it. And the adjournment was another 6 months. So a 6 month is the same as a 1 year sentence. So you've got to serve another 6 months in limbo, not knowing what waits ahead of you, all because the reports weren't done on time. No fault of your own, but it doesn't matter to you. It doesn't matter that it's not your fault. Because it's their fault, then it's just brushed aside. You've got to wait another 6 months. There's nothing you can do whatsoever. Your hands are tied. You just have to sit and suffer in silence for another 6 months and make sure nothing happens in the prison within 6 months. Because if something happens that's even out of your control, like there's a fight on the wing or someone comes running past you who's having a bad day and they're just attempting to attack you or something, and then you turn around and try to defend yourself, or you have an argument and you shout something verbal abuse gets put down as violence, an act of violence, then your parole board, they might as well be scrapped, because when you come back on your parole board in that 6 months time, because you've used verbal violence, you will be getting another 12 to 18 month knockback until you can prove that you can behave on the wing. So these are the things that you come up against when you're an IPP prisoner, and this is the reasons why people are sitting in prison 10 years over tariff. Another problem of IPP sentencing are the mental health challenges presented by having an indeterminate sentence. PRT data shows people given IPPs are disproportionately likely to have pre-existing mental health problems and the indeterminacy of imprisonment can exasperate prisoners feeling hopeless and helpless. Meanwhile, prisoners who have already served their minimum term and waiting for parole are likely to feel disenfranchised, frustrated and distressed, which may limit progress towards release. IPP prisoners also demonstrate a higher risk of self-harm, over twice that of people serving life. So there's over 80 people, I think around about 85, 86 IPP prisoners committed suicide because of the exasperated feelings of hopelessness, helplessness, anxiety, depression, all the mental health problems you can think of. IPP prisoners experience them in one form or another, waiting to be released on this never-ending sentence. In September 2022, the House of Commons Justice Committee sent a report to the government detailing a number of recommendations. In February 2023, the government accepted the need to update its IPP action plan, which it said is the best option for prisoners to progress towards a safe release. However, the government rejected the committee's primary recommendation of conducting a resentencing exercise. Dominic Raab, the then Secretary of State for Justice, said in response, retrospective resentencing of IPP offenders could lead to the immediate release of many offenders who have been assessed as unsafe for release by the parole board, many with no period of supervision in the community. The government's long-held view is that this would give rise to an unacceptable risk to the public protection, and that the IPP action plan, suitably updated, remains the best option by which these offenders can progress towards safe release. As such, the government has no plans to conduct a resentencing exercise. Now, we've spoke about this before, and I've done IPP topics when I've mentioned it before, and that was just another get-out clause for them, saying that if they resentenced everybody, there would be dangerous offenders immediately released. But if they'd done it properly and resentenced everybody individually, and the ones that are deemed a risk to the public, then keep them on another sentence, or keep them on something where they don't get released straight away. Give them the help they need to gradually release them back into society. No one is saying release them immediately, because there is, as I know myself, dangerous people. But the majority of them, around, I bet you any money, around about 90%, are no longer dangerous. They're just suffering with the mental health. So try and get them out of prison and re-sentence them, but keep the dangerous ones on, like the predators that harm children who are actually a risk and they're presenting a risk still. Give them, or keep them on IPP and re-sentence the ones that were in for minor crimes and get them back out into the community. The Justice Committee expressed regret that the government had rejected its recommendation on re-sentencing. The chair of the committee, Bob Neal, said the response was a missed opportunity to right a wrong. The decision was also criticised by campaigning organisations such as PRT. So that was the end of that report in the National World newspaper, or the online paper, sorry. But I'll just go on to talk about another one which is in the news today. Just let us find this one, people. Here it is. So the headline is 11 years for stealing a mobile phone. Inside the lives of IPP prisoners serving sentences of psychological torture. Now, when it says the headline that 11 years for stealing a phone, we all know it's more than likely been like a street robbery. So it's not a case of just stealing somebody's phone. Obviously, the offender has probably been a street robbery or something as such, and this is the reason why he's been given IPP. But they've been given IPPs with a recommendation of 12 months, because if you're getting a 12-month recommendation, then the sentence isn't deemed that such in a high category where it deserves a life sentence. So it would have normally been a 2-year sentence, but they've given a 12-month IPP, which doesn't justify keeping somebody in 11 years for trying to or stealing a mobile phone. Thousands of prisoners remain incarcerated on open-ended prison sentences under a now defunct scheme that even its creator, former Home Secretary Lord David Blunkett, feels deep regret over. So when I've looked up under it before, David Blunkett, who actually brought the IPPs into law, has went on to say he has sleepless nights. It's the biggest regret of his life. It's a decision that he wished he never made. But why can't he, or how come he's a Lord, so how come he hasn't got the power to right this wrong? Surely, somewhere, someone has the power to overturn this for everybody and get the rest of the IPPs out and give them the justice that they deserve. And again, people will be saying, well, how do they deserve justice when they committed the crimes? But like I mentioned in the last IPP video, the IPP prisoners have now went on to become victims of the IPPs. They've went from perpetrator to victim because they've left them in prison that long. They're suffering with the mental health, and they're now using the mental health against them, saying that they're not fit for release because of the mental health. But they're not fit for release because of the mental health. But it's the IPP that's give them the mental health. So how can that be justified? It just doesn't make sense. And something needs to be done across the board, which it will in time. I believe that in the next few years, the IPPs will be no more, and they will get everybody back out, and they will probably reduce the license to round about a 5-year. And once you've spent 5 years in the community, you will be scrapped. It'll be gone completely. That is what I believe will be happening in the next few years, just to try and get the rest of the IPPs out. But I'll just see if I can find anything else about what else it says about this lad here that's just been released. Oh, sorry. It says here, actually he's still in prison. It says, I don't visit the prison anymore to see him because he's unrecognizable. His eyes are dark, he's exhausted, mentally, physically, emotionally. This is how Clara White speaks about her brother. Thomas White, who has been in prison for the past 11 years for stealing a mobile phone. During that time, much of which Thomas has spent in solitary confinement, Clara has witnessed her brother languish in his prison cell while his mental health has deteriorated to the extent that he has now been diagnosed with psychosis and suffers from hallucinations. His language was becoming something we didn't understand. Now, I've done a podcast with a lad whose brother is IPP, and he talks about his brother, and it mentions the same sort of thing about you can't understand what he's trying to say on the phone. But if you go down and have a look, you'll see the podcast I've done. I'll put the link in the description. And Joseph's talking about his brother Martin, who's suffering with his mental health really badly, and he's scared that he might take his own life because he's attempted it in the past. And it sounds similar to what he's saying here about they start talking all gibberish and they don't understand what they're saying. They're actually covering the doors up, the cell doors from the inside, thinking that people's trying to poison them, people's against them. And this is what's happening to the mental health. They're getting diagnosed with psychosis. They think everyone's after them. So it went on to say he would tell us that he met Moses in the segregation unit. He wore his bedding as his own clothes. He went round the wings and he would bless people who he would tell them that he was Jesus Christ. The picture she paints of her brother in prison is a far cry from the musically talented but troubled person who entered it aged 27, having been handed a special kind of prison sentence that courts in England and Wales could impose between 2005 and 2012. But again, like Joseph, when he was speaking about his brother Martin, when they're coming up for the parole hearing, they're knocking them back, saying that they're unfit for release because of the mental health, which you can probably understand because they're going on the parole board and they're saying some crazy stuff, and they're giving them a knockback of 18 to 24 months. But what's happening in that time? They're leaving them in the same cell until they come up to the next year. And so what are they expecting that prisoner to achieve within that time? Surely they should be sending them to a specialist hospital, something like there's a place up here called St. Nick's, or even Rampton or Ashworth Hospital. Send them somewhere so they can get the help, the medication to get them back on track and ready for release into society, instead of putting them in a pad, leaving them for another year to 2 years, coming back on another parole hearing, when the mental health would have deteriorated even longer or even more since the last time they went up on the hearing. It just doesn't make sense. Why put them back in a pad and leave them for 2 years to deteriorate even more so they can come back on the parole board, speak a load of more gobbledygook, and then get knocked back again for another 2 years? All right, I'll just move on a little bit further to see what it says here. So Thomas was sentenced to 2 years for stealing the mobile phone in a non-violent exchange back in 2012. But because he had 16 previous convictions for theft and robberies, he was given an IPP sentence and has served 11 years. So there was no violence involved. He stole the mobile phone where he probably took it off someone in the street, like I mentioned previously. And he's been done with a street robbery, but there's no violence involved. How can you justify keeping somebody in a prison cell for 11 years for stealing a mobile phone when some people only serve that for murder? He has only met his son Caden once when he was 9 months old. Although IPPs have been abolished, I'll not get on that because I mentioned that. The objective of the IPP was to ensure that repeat offenders who were deemed a risk to the public were not just released at the end of their tariff. So what, keep them in for 12, 15 years? So this is the crimes IPP prisoners were sentenced for. It was brought out primarily for sex offenders, but believe it or not, out of the 8,500 or just over 8,500 that got it, only 2,508 were for sex offences. 3,045 were for violent offences. 1,882 robbery offences. 448 set and fire offences. 232 acquisitive offences. 11 drug offences. And 355 other offences. But when you hear about the IPPs and you actually hear about some of the horror stories of why they actually got this sentence, the normal average Joe public won't or cannot comprehend how this can happen, but it's actually going on to this very day, and it's just amazing how they haven't been brought up and abolished retrospectively. But it was even in the Inside Times last week, the head of the United Nations has called up on the UK government to do something about this because it has been deemed a torturous sentence. But there was a story of another prisoner who was doing a normal sentence in prison and he was suffering with his mental health, and the Mufti team come to drag him out of his pad and take him to the block because he'd smashed his pad up. But at the time, I think it was when you could still smoke in your cells, he pulled out a lighter and set fire to his cell bell, which is just your emergency bell. It's like a little plastic button on some of them. And he set fire to that, and it's been classed as arson, and he was given IPP, and he's still in prison like 12 years later. How can they justify that? He was only in for something like shoplifting. So he's went in to do a few months for shoplifting, ended up getting IPP for lighting something in his pad and being in there for 12 years, and he's still in there now. Right, goes on a little bit further to talk about things, but it talks about what I've just mentioned in the last article, so I'll not go on further about that. But Sir Bob hopes that the Justice Secretary, Alex Chalk, will show more of a willingness to consider his proposals than his predecessor Dominic Raab, who flatly rejected the suggestions on the grounds resentencing would give rise to an unacceptable risk to public protection. Mr. Chalk, who replaced Raab in April, has called IPP sentences a stain on our justice system that should never have happened. So if Mr. Chalk is the one actually saying this is where there is some hope for the likes of all of us IPPs still serving the sentence, because if he says that this should never have happened, and he is the one now who is in control and has the power to do something about the IPPs, surely if he's saying it should never have happened, something will happen. He's got the power to rectify this. It says, however, like his predecessor, Mr. Chalk has described facing a conundrum in wanting to solve the injustice of the IPP sentence while also feeling a duty to protect the public. The Justice Secretary has revised the IPP action plan starting under Mr. Robb, which aims to solve the dilemma by reducing the number of those in prison even further. In a direct appeal to Mr. Chalk, Sir Bob said Alex is a good man and a highly experienced criminal barrister. He's actually seen these sentences in operation in the way that some of his predecessors perhaps didn't. So I say to him, Alex, you're a lawyer, follow the evidence. So again, this is where I believe Mr. Chalk will do something about the IPP and give hope to the rest of us still serving this sentence. More so for the ones that are still in prison, because even though the likes of myself are on the outside and I've built a life for myself and I've moved on with my life, you've still got the constant worry because you're IPP. It never leaves you. It's with you on a daily basis. Even though you're out here leading a normal, crime-free lifestyle, enjoying your life with your wife, your kids, your family, you've always got the fear of the IPP, the fear of recall to prison. And it will never leave you until you get that letter through saying that your IPP has been terminated completely. So on that, Lord Blunkett has a clear message. If change is not made in the House of Commons, we'll do everything we can in the House of Lords. We've just got to get common sense back into this situation for the sake of all of those, including the families who have been suffering for this long. And that's what people overlook, like the families as well. The families are suffering because the people out here that have lost loved ones in prison, how are they ever going to get justice for the loved ones when they could have been back out on the streets after 12 to 18 months, but they've been in there for 15 years and they could no longer go on, so they've ended up killing themselves and taking their own lives. There's just no justice in it whatsoever, and it needs to be rectified completely. But I'm going to leave that one there for now, people. If you are still watching the video and you've managed to get to the end, if you are IPP and you're out here in the community and you want to come on my channel and share your story, drop us an email. The link is in the description, and you can come on and highlight your ongoing struggle with the IPP. Come and share your story. Come and voice your opinion. Don't be scared to tell your story of IPP, what you've witnessed in prison. You've still got a freedom of speech. You can still come on and talk about your IPP, talk about your life, talk about how it's impacted you, and let everybody else know out here in the community what it's actually like serving this sentence. But I'll leave that one there for now, people. Take care.